Hi, everybody. This is Gino Vanelli. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
The views and opinions expressed on the following program are those of the persons appearing on the program.
Today on Rainbow Country, a spotlight on a new documentary, Queering the Interior, a short documentary which spans decades and centers on the people and moments that define the queer community in the BC interior, specifically the Kootenays, Nelson, BC. Plus later on in Hour 1, the story behind Bryan Adams' #1 Studio 54 disco hit, Let Me Take You Dancing. All that and more on episode 330, so stay tuned for Gay Talk Radio right here on Rainbow Country.
Hi, this is Emily Saliers from Indigo Girls.
Hey everyone, this is Chris Harder, porn star, burlesque performer, and the creator of Porn to Be a Star. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Well, hello and welcome to a brand new journey through Rainbow Country. As I like to call it, a little gay radio show working to give voice to the LGBT community and beyond. And as always, I am your tour guide through Rainbow Country. I'm producer and host, Mark Tara. By the way, Rainbow Country originates from CIUT-FM in Toronto, and now proudly in syndication on 12 outlets across Canada, from coast to coast to coast. The Yukon, British Columbia, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, the east coast of Canada in Newfoundland, Ontario, even down to Buffalo, New York, and online. Well, thanks to you tuning in, streaming, downloading, but ultimately listening. Together we continue to build Rainbow Country into a nationally syndicated gay radio show, a #1 LGBT podcast on Podomatic.com's gay and lesbian chart, as well as being recognized as Canada's #2 LGBT podcast on feedspot.com. So today, director, producer, writer, educator, filmmaker, Amy Bohigian joins me to talk about Queering the Interior, a new short documentary which spans decades and essentially tells the story of the queering of the BC interior. Plus in Hour 2, music from LGBT artists, independent artists, voices that we've come to know and love in classic disco, classic 80s, classic house, and on this episode, I'm featuring some classic disco, a spotlight on Irene Cara, and more. All that lies ahead as we start Journey 330 through Rainbow Country, and our first stop is what I like to call the Rainbow Country School for Canadian Gay History. And on today's session from activist, author, and historian Tim McCaskill, Operation Soap, the Toronto bathhouse raids of February 5th, 1981.
If we think of the 1970s as the period where the gay community was trying to get noticed, the 1980s was the time when we actually got noticed and started getting seriously slammed. The cops had never been happy with Trudeau's 1969 decriminalization. If you look at historian Tom Hooper's work, you'll see that arrests of gay men actually increased across the country after decriminalization. Remember, this was way before apps. If you wanted to hook up, baths or bars were the best places to go, so those were the places that police targeted. There were a series of bath and bar raids in Montreal and Toronto and Edmonton and Ottawa and other cities. The Toronto bath raids of February 5th, 1981 are the most famous. When Toronto's pro-gay mayor John Sewell and the first openly gay candidate for city council, George Hislop, were both defeated in the municipal elections in 1980, the cops figured we were vulnerable and swooped. They smashed into most of the city's gay baths, trashed the places, and arrested almost 300 men on a range of charges. It wasn't just the baths, they were also hassling the bars on concocted liquor license violations, and they were busting individuals in bookstores for porn. Basically, they were trying to shut down the gay village and recriminalize homosexuality. But that night when they hit the baths, they bit off more than they could chew. In Toronto, for the first time, the activists and the small business people and the normally non-political bar and bath patrons all came together in a series of massive demonstrations. We raised money to fight the charges in court and won. We made common cause with Black and South Asian communities who are also experiencing police brutality and harassment, and we demanded community control of the police. We called for changes to the criminal code to get rid of antiquated laws that still criminalized sex. That new community unity also laid the foundation for dealing with the next crisis that was about to affect us all, the AIDS epidemic. This is Tim McCaskill, a gay liberation dinosaur from another planet and author of Queer Progress.
Hi, I'm Saida Garrett, co-writer of Michael Jackson's Man in the Mirror, and you're listening to Rainbow Country with Mr. Mark Tara.
Up next, queering the interior. Amy Bohigian, hi, how are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I am well. I am better now that I am speaking to you, to have your voice, your story be heard by the LGBT community and beyond. So thank you for that, especially to talk about queering the interior. This is your documentary. Talk to me about this documentary. It's a short. It's about 45 minutes or so.
That's right. It's kind of mid-length.
Yeah. What is this documentary about?
Well, we wanted to highlight some of the pioneers of our rural queer community here in Nelson and the Kootenays, which is basically southern British Columbia, southern interior. And we knew we had a really rich, vibrant community that was unique to a lot of rural spaces. And our local museum commissioned this documentary as part of a exhibit that was also going up about the queer history here in this region last summer for Pride. And so we were going to do a short 10-minute piece. And when I got deeper into the research and started talking to the key people that I felt like kind of held this history, it was really obvious that we needed to expand the film. And so the director of the Museum and Art Gallery at what was formerly called Touchstones is now called the Nelson Museum Archives and Art Gallery, Astrid Heyerdahl and I worked together, and I said, we have to expand this. There's too many stories to tell. And so we did do a 10-minute piece to cut into the exhibit last summer. And then we created this 45-minute piece a few months later and released it this last summer to the community at the theater. And it was just kind of a celebration and also just a tribute to these folks that have really pushed for visibility and rights in our community and in a rural space, which is traditionally not where a lot of queer people choose to live. Mm. Yeah.
So you just mentioned that this was commissioned by the art gallery, I believe.
That's right. There's an archive, museum, and art gallery that was formerly called Touchstones. It's now called Nelson Museum Archives and Art Gallery, and they were the ones who really wanted to bring this into their space. Yes. And
why did they want to do this? Was there like an LGBT component to the gallery?
Well, I think they've recognized under Astrid's leadership that they have been missing a lot of voices in that museum for, the time that they had begun, and it didn't represent the full spectrum of our community. It was a lot of history about loggers and miners and a little bit of indigenous history that was really from the settler point of view. And so they've really made efforts in the last 5 years to bring in these kind of missing voices. And this was part of that intention, as well as having a pride exhibit, which was a huge part of that vision as well. Like, so having an entire exhibit in the space that was all about queer history. And Michael Wicks, who has been living in this community for many years, in the 70s, 80s, and then moved away and came back a few years ago, he's been working on building a queer archives. And so he's really interested in preserving and kind of collecting and celebrating queer history through the museum archives. And so because there was actually some materials to work with, both video and lots of photos and documents from different meetings over the years, I felt like, there was enough to work with as a filmmaker, and the museum also felt the same way, that there was material to work with as a documentary filmmaker. You kind of need something. So that's when we decided to go ahead and make this film. So and then Michael Wicks became instrumental, and he was actually featured in the film as well. So because he's been an activist in this community for many years and is still very active in collecting that history.
So the documentary features a number of members of the LGBT community. How did you go about selecting who would be interviewed for the documentary?
Well, partly small town fashion. I mean, by knowing a lot of people personally that I knew I could at least reach out and connect, because I'm, in the queer community myself and have lived here since 2006. I moved into a very vibrant, queer community and knew some of the people who had been working on the front lines, who started Pride in 1996 here, and TransConnect, the first rural program that supports trans folks. So I kind of knew, and I've done the work as a documentary filmmaker here for 15 years. I knew a fair number of those people. Now, that being said, there's many people I didn't know, and lots of folks from the 70s and 80s who surfaced only through conversations with folks I knew from the 90s and aughts that were basically saying, oh, you have to talk to Robert, you have to talk to Henry. They were these awesome hairdressers from that era. And, make sure you talk to Sophia, make sure you talk to Norma. And, of course, you've got to talk to Christopher. And so, of course, small towns are easy that way. You kind of, if you're a known entity already, people can open up a little faster to you. I'm not coming off the CBC van putting a microphone in people's faces. I'm kind of a living here, and I was part of the community. So just one conversation after another. I had a research assistant. We called dozens and dozens of people, had hours and hours of conversations, and just started piecing together what were the key moments, who were the key people, what was really important about, what happened over the years. And we really want to represent the spectrum of the community as well, not just a lesbian, gay perspective, but the two-spirited voices, the trans voices, the bisexual, everything. We really wanted to try to represent the full spectrum of the community. So that was part of the intention as well.
And some of the footage, the archival footage that you guys have, I'm sure from people's personal collections, like photos and videos, that must have been a process.
Yeah, I think when you get into documentary, you're somewhat in denial about how much footage you have to go through. But every documentary I've ever done, it's kind of like, well, yeah, there's, a lot of hours to move through. But I think that's part of the process, is you start learning what's out there through the material and who was important. And so it's part of the whole creative process. And of course, I have help doing that as well. It's not just me for hours, but I do think that, we have a lot to, be grateful for, and that Michael Wicks collected a lot of that. And then because we were in touch with so many people were really behind the project, they would send me lots of things. And so we got to build the archives through this process as well. We just got more and more footage and more pictures. And so just the archives keeps getting stronger.
Did anything surprise you during the process of researching this documentary and the stories of Nelson?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think being someone who came out in the mid-90s, or kind of the early to mid-90s, myself as a lesbian, and going through college and feeling like it was a hidden identity that was just starting to get visibility both on TV and kind of on college campuses, I feel like I certainly knew, I paid attention to the history of the queer community, but I I think when you talk to people face to face and you really pay attention to the stories of folks who came before you, or elders, if you will, I think you really feel like, there's nothing like a personal story to really bring it all together for you. Like when you learn about Harvey and Milk, and you learn about folks in Stonewall and the things like the Toronto bathhouses, you certainly feel connected to that. But it happened somewhere else. And all the people I talked to, they grew up here, they moved here. And so when it's right in your own backyard, I'm literally walking to meet people for coffee who've lived here for decades to talk about the fact that they were gay bashed in the same alleys that I walk down every day. Like, I think not a surprise per se, but kind of a revelation of the sacrifices people made just to be who they were, and knowing that we all have. But I came on their backs. I was able to come out of that, their generation, and come into my own generation. And now we have young people in droves that are finding space in school that I would have never dreamed of. So, I mean, I'm kind of I would say like a sandwich generation in a couple of ways, like, almost 50, and I've got kids of my own who are teaching me about the language around non-binary and gender diversity. Right. And so we've got a long way to go. Kids are still very marginalized, but I think that the surprise element for me was just the kind of beautiful people I met along the way were just amazing to see how much they have been able to lay the foundation for the rest of us.
In queering the interior, during the course of the documentary, there are a number of issues that face the LGBT community. Obviously, homophobia, trans issues, coming out stories, the effect of colonization on the Two-Spirit community. These issues that came up during the documentary, did that happen organically, just as you were asking people questions and interviewing them and filming them, or was there a roadmap of certain things that you wanted to touch on?
I think a little bit of both. I think that's the kind of artistic process of making a documentary. Like, you write what we call a treatment rather than a script, because a treatment's kind of a suggestion of what you think has happened based on the research you've done. And then that's usually, you've probably done some pre-interviews by that point. You've talked to a number of people, and you've cast your folks that you want in the film. But in terms of trans history or two-spirited history, like, it's also about knowing ahead of time whose voices you would like to include. And then from that point forward, you just hope that the right stories do emerge. I mean, for sure, for me as a white settler here, I didn't know much about the two-spirited voices that were in our community, never mind the history of what that meant. And I think, like a lot of folks that are settlers, we don't have a lot of dialogue going. So film's a great way to start understanding that as a first step. And now I think the folks that were in the film, as well as other two-spirited voices and people in our community, are a little better understood, especially within our own queer community here. So it's like a bit of a chicken and egg situation documentary. It's a dance that I really do love. Like, I love that I don't know exactly where it's going, and it kind of leads you, but you also have to have some idea of who you want and what you're trying to say. And that's the research for sure.
Queering the Interior. That's the title of this documentary. Where does this title come from?
Well, I think the verb is important because it's still happening. And like, I think it's about, there's a lot of books now that are, this actually shares the title with some other book I think a couple of gay guys wrote about interior design, funnily enough. When I Googled it, I was like, okay, I think I can live alongside that. We're different enough. We're not a documentary about interior design, but like, I think it's about the fact that people actively took their space. They literally, decided, yes, I could go and live in Vancouver, Toronto, or San Francisco in the 80s, especially in those time frames. But I've decided to live here. And what that meant for them was to literally be authentic to who their queer identity was. And then living in the interior, I mean, it's all about this film. It's specifically is about taking that space in a rural area, which is typically not where queer people have set up camp. So, I mean, of course, there's queer people everywhere in the world, and there's lots of rural folks, but we don't see their stories as much. So I think it's really actively trying to name what it's all about, is basically people taking space in an interior, and also the interior of our own lives, right? Like our inner landscapes and stuff. So you can take that lots of different deep directions, but that's kind of the title and the intention of it.
And on that note, we will return after this Rainbow Country update.
Hi, I'm Justin Ling, author of Missing from the Village. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Hitmakers is a full-service, award-winning record label and social enterprise based in Iqaluit, Nunavut. We specialize in the creating and marketing of world-class Inuit and Indigenous music, including pop, hip-hop, rock, folk, and traditional Inuit music. Hitmakers has studios in Iqaluit, Ottawa, and Toronto. The label currently works with more than 20 Inuit and Indigenous artists, and we represent and promote many more. The company was founded in 2016, and our mission is to create viable careers in the arts for Inuit and Indigenous artists through music, media, and education. Our secondary mission is to empower artists to share and strengthen their stories and culture. To learn more, please connect with us on social media or at hitmakers.com. That's Hitmakers with a Z. Thanks for listening. Qoya namit.
As you know, Rainbow Country is heard on community and campus radio, as well as on streaming. What do all of these outlets have in common? Well, they are all listener-supported. To keep the lights on, the streams, and the airwaves broadcasting. So I wanted to take this time to give some special shout-outs to individuals who recently contributed to their local outlets that carry Rainbow Country. Arts and culture radio producer and host Donna G of The More the Merrier, who says, because Mark's little gay radio show deserves its place on CIUT. Donna G, I thank you for your support. Zachary Corbett. Zachary, thank you for your support. Greg Blanchard. Greg, thank you for letting your voice be heard. David Gale, a longtime advocate and champion of equality and diversity in Canada's film industry, and the first openly gay president of ACTRA, Toronto. David Gale, thank you. Rapper and spoken word artist, the Mangfather, Bob Katz, who says, quote, I love Rainbow Country. It's the best. Bob Katz, thank you. You're the best. World champion ballroom dancer and choreographer, Brian Torner. Brian, thank you. Trans recording artist, Lynx Dean. Lynx Dean, thank you. And Natasha Kowalski. Natasha, thank you. Here is some feedback from Ottawa, Canada's capital, from Peter B., who calls himself Homo Boy, me, it, thing, and who listens to Rainbow Country on CKCU FM in Ottawa, and says, thank you for your beautiful, filled show. I rarely get to listen live. Peace and love to all. Pass, hugs, forward. Donate, peeps. Community radio is important. Peter B., you said it perfectly. By the way, it is never too late to donate, so if you are able to, please consider making a donation to this very outlet you are tuned to. If you're listening to the edited podcast version, consider making a donation to your local outlet that does carry Rainbow Country. And for a full list of those outlets, those 12 outlets across Canada, visit my website, marktara.com, and hit the syndication banner. Let your voice, let your support for independent LGBT radio content be heard.
Hi, my name is Joanne Vanicola, and I'm an actor and a writer, and I was first on Rainbow Country with Mark Tara on discussing the massacre at Pulse Club in Orlando. I realized how important it was for our community to have a radio station, specifically for our issues, to talk about people in the LGBTQ community and to provide an outlet for our stories, to discuss our politics, culture, and give voice to the issues that matter to us. And of course our artists and the things that we do globally, and talk about culture. And without people like Mark Tara providing a space for this with a radio show like this, then we wouldn't have that voice. So support, tune in. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Cameron Bailey, Artistic Director and Co-Head of TIFF, the Toronto International Film Festival. You're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
So, Amy, you've written, you've produced, you've directed award-winning films for broadcast TV, on digital platforms, for film festivals. How did you get into filmmaking in the first place? How did this all come about for you?
Yeah, I mean, the real reason is I'm just really curious, and I love people's stories, and don't we all? Like, why wouldn't I want to do that professionally? Like, if we go to a dinner party, the best part is hearing, the fun stories or the interesting, dramatic stories people have. So if I'm already doing that, why not do it professionally? But I took a bit of a detour after I was like doing it as a hobby as a kid. I kind of, not a detour, I certainly intended to be in education. And I was a teacher for many years in various settings. I came back to it when I moved to Nelson about 15 years ago. So this hasn't been my adult profession forever, but I just knew I wanted to do something creative, and I felt like having a camera was an invitation into other people's worlds. And if I could do that, and learn about other people and why they do what they do, then why wouldn't I do that? So, it's kind of always a bit of a amazement to me that I'm able to get paid to kind of knock on people's doors with a camera and go in and ask them lots of questions about their lives. And then I get the process of putting it all together with a team of people that I really enjoy working with. So I'm just really fortunate to have really grown into this profession, and I get to explore these topics that have a lot of meaning for me personally, as well as, for trying to have impact and tell stories that I think will maybe change the needle just a little, move the needle just a little bit on social issues. So a lot of the work I do has a lot to do with marginalized voices. So that fits right into the mission of what I do for my work.
Watershed Productions, Inc. This is your award-winning production house. You guys do documentaries, commercials, episodic TV. What led you then to create Watershed Productions, Inc.?
Yeah, I mean, it was just the place I housed kind of my ambition to tell these kind of stories. And Watershed to me represents community. So much of my work actually happens right here. Like, I sometimes can pack the gear that I'm working with, meet my crew, and walk to our location. I think I have kids and, they're teenagers now, but I've really tried to stay in one place a little bit more than I could have if I lived in a bigger city and been flying places. But I feel like our local is really important. And so regional local stories to me, that's the watershed part of it for me. And also the watershed moments of our lives. So we try to capture what's been kind of seminal in people's lives or seminal moments in our community. And documenting has always been something I've really enjoyed doing. And now it's moved in a little bit further to, I'm working on a scripted TV series that's more based in a comedy genre. And like I came out of the last film that I made that was a documentary about our town and all the characters that live here and focused on the municipal election. And there was definitely comedic elements in that, but I felt like I would like to try my hand at a new genre. And so I'm working with a writing team, and I'm creating a show called Southern Interior, actually, to borrow the word interior, that kind of looks at all the different ways that we live together in this community and the different lifestyles that we have here that I think are quite unique to any other rural area. I dare you to come to any other rural area this size and find the variety and the types of lifestyles you'll find in Nelson. So I'm fascinated by it. So now I'm kind of exploring that in a new way.
And it's not about making your interiors look Southern.
Yeah, I'm not writing a book alongside it. Exactly.
So watershed moments. You are lesbian. You are you have kids, and that's a huge watershed moment, having kids. But growing up, first of all, did you know that you had same-sex attraction, that you were attracted to other women, or was that something that happened later on in life for you? And did you want kids growing up as well?
Those are some good questions. Well, I think like a lot of queer kids, there were hints of it that in retrospect you go, right. Like that gym teacher clearly knew I was one of those kids. But I was the tomboy. I mean, I was really typically kind of like that little baby dyke that I'm sure lots of other people could see. But I'm not like it wasn't that straightforward for me, like literally and figuratively. Like I think that I definitely felt the attraction for women in college. That's where I met my first girlfriend, and that's when I came out to my parents, somewhat accidentally. But it just kind of all snowballed. By the end of college, I was kind of half out to some of my friends, and it was just a little bit of a messy time for anybody coming out. I think we can all relate to the fact that like we don't even really know who around us might be gay, because we're kind of closeted at that point to ourselves, never mind to everyone else. Like especially in the mid 90s, and now too, depending on where you live, there's still not 100% safety for you can't assume just because we're in 2022. But like by the time I got to the end of college, I thought, well, I'm going to go to San Francisco. First of all, I just broke up with my girlfriend, and I thought it was a great idea to follow her out there. So really great choice. But that first year in San Francisco, kind of realized like there's a whole world out here, right? It wasn't also roses and pride parades every day. So I felt like there was a reality there living in San Francisco that I wasn't ready to meet, even though there was a huge queer community waiting there. So that was nice for a year, but then I kind of turned around and kind of did a few other things with my time and didn't stay in California. Eventually settled in Boston, and then went to Toronto, and then eventually out to Nelson. So when I met my wife in Toronto, by that point I was a few years in, and no, it wasn't on my mind to have kids. I really don't think that was a narrative a lot of my lesbian friends had at that point. Even as we got into our early 20s, I think we were still fighting for marriage equality. It was like one step at a time here. And so personally, what's really kind of incongruent about that is that I had worked with kids as an educator for a long time. I was probably the most youth-oriented person in my peer group, and yet I still didn't think of myself being a mother. So that's the extent to which I think queer people can repress what could be a natural instinct for them. Now, when I met Jane, we did start talking about it a couple years into our relationship as a way to just kind of explore and maybe put that question to rest. Like a lot of women in their late 30s and early 40s kind of feel like they have to make that decision intentionally. And I think we kind of felt like, well, let's at least put it to rest. And when we really explored it, we kind of went, actually, we kind of want to try this, like not just try it. Let's do this. Like, let's full on commit to going down this path. And we decided adoption was our best fit. For a few different reasons, but it's just such a personal choice. And we've got lots of friends who've done all sorts of ways of having kids these days. So we just decided adoption, and we went down that road. And within a year, we were matched with our twin boy girl, Franny and Theo. And now they were 15 months old when we brought them home, and now they're 15 years old next week. So
wow,
it's been a journey for sure.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's been a journey. Why did you move to Nelson?
Yeah, well, I don't move places out of logic. I've noticed in my life. I did my move to San Francisco following my girlfriend, ex-girlfriend. I moved to Toronto to try to save a relationship. I didn't move to Nelson to save a relationship. I moved here because Jane had lived here for 6 months on a sabbatical from her full-time job in Toronto. So I came to visit her once when she was here, and then a couple more times together when we were, looking at maybe moving out of Toronto. And just, like anyone who's ever been in this part of the country and in this part of BC, it's gorgeous, but not just that, it's the people. It's the people who are just, there's a way this place has grown over the decades, layers of these incredibly tolerant and, accepting kind of community here. And I there's definitely there's many sides to that. It's not all perfect every day, but I do think if I wanted to live in a rural area, this was a place that I felt. And so, I felt like was going to be really safe and accepting for us. And there was a really vibrant lesbian community here. Of the 90s, droves of lesbians moved here from cities like Vancouver and like Northern California and in Toronto. And like, we just became a known entity because there was so many gay men that lived here in the 80s, and that lesbians started to see this as a queer friendly community. And that literally made all the difference for us, because had that not been here, I don't think it would have been on the radar for us. It was really important that we be part of that community. So Nelson, just it captures lots of people for different reasons, but it's always the same story at the end of the day. Like, you love the beauty of it, you love the people and the community vibe, and that's why most of us are here. Yeah.
Well, Rainbow Country airs in Nelson on what, CJLY?
Yeah, that would be our local Kootenai Co-op.
Yes. Yeah. So hey, Nelson.
Hey, Nelson, what's up?
So where were you born?
I grew up in St. Louis, Missouri.
Oh, wow.
And Midwestern gal. And my family, my parents are there, as well as some of my extended family. And I do go back there and visit. And I've got friends on different coasts in the States. And so I get back and cross that border every now and then and dip back down to the States, cheer for the Cardinals, that kind of thing. Yep.
And what made you move to Canada then?
Right. Well, again, like I said, this is the third bad move of my life. Like the second bad move. My third move was the best, out to Nelson. When I finally got the relationship right, with Jane. Well, I was in a relationship. It was kind of like long distance for a couple years after I went to grad school with this woman, and she was in Toronto and I was in Boston, and we just couldn't find a way for her to come to Boston. So I said, well, I'm going to just check it out. I'm going to see what Toronto's all about. So out of pure stubbornness, because I was tired of being in a long distance relationship, I kind of packed everything up and went up to Toronto and just to give it a try. And I was pretty much ready to come back and pack it back to Boston, because that was kind of where my best friends in my life had been for a few years. And I got a job directing a summer camp and outdoor education center, which for me was kind of a culminating point in my career as an educator. So I took that and just stayed. I stayed for about 5 years in Toronto. And towards the last 2 or 3 years I was in Toronto, that's when I met Jane, my current partner and wife. So, good things can happen out of not so great choices. It's, something that happens a lot in all of our lives. Like, one thing leads to another. And I think, I tried to make the best of it. And look, I got, this amazing life out of being in Canada. So honestly, when you think about what's happening in the States and some of the rights that are being taken away, thematically, I feel really grateful that I'm in Canada. Not that I'm necessarily consider myself a political refugee or anything too extreme, but there is a way in which it becomes an intentional choice to be here rather than there after a few years, right? And I didn't think of myself moving back to the States necessarily when I got to Nelson, because I do love it here, but at this point, I just can't imagine it. It's a tough place to get your head around living at this point, as compared to Canada, I should say.
So queering the interior, it's a well done, well made, powerful documentary, telling some of Canadian gay history, in my opinion. Mm-hmm. What's the plan for this documentary? How will Canadians be able to see this?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good question. I've been thinking about how to answer this because right at this point, we'll have access to it through the Nelson Museum and Archives website. So if you were to Google Nelson Museum and Archives and Gallery, you'd be able to watch it via their website. That being said, the piece could easily be kind of reworked so that it's less, I feel right now it's very specific to our area, and there's ways in which I think it could be, not to say to take out the local specificity, but to make it even more Canadian kind of, so that people can relate to it outside of this region. Because it was really the real intention was to share it with our regional audience here as a museum piece. I think because it started out like for the exhibit as to document our queer history here, and then it kind of expanded. It hasn't really thought of itself as a Canadian film per se. Like some of the other films that I've done, there's an audience beyond the walls of our region in mind when you're making it. But with this one, it was really, to me, honestly, I was hoping that we could show it. The main audience would be young people in schools that live in this region. And that feels really rewarding on a level, because there's a lot of films that you try to reach for like millions of people to see through a broadcast. And this one is like, if the person who came up to me after the film, the person who came up to me after the film first was a young trans man who said, oh my God, like, first off, I want to be part of the Trans Connect program. Where do I go to be in the Trans Connect program? Because that's part of what's in the film, through Christopher Moore's incredible work, and like literally was looking for resources right there and then. And I thought, well, if that's what we're doing with this film is to connect young people who watch it to the resources that we have already built in this community, then fantastic. So not to say I don't want other people to see it, because that's not what a filmmaker really wants. They want to have an audience for their film, but definitely you can see it through the Nelson Museum and Archives website, as well as have been some festivals and some groups that have played it. So if people are interested in screening this film, we certainly have had like at least half a dozen groups that have, hosted evenings where like it's for Pride or for Advocacy Canada here in BC is going to be showing it as part of their, they're going to have a panel. They're going to have like a entire night dedicated to the film. Like, so there's ways in which community groups around have been able to use the film and show it. And I think it's had a really good impact, especially if someone like Robert Varigan, who's featured in the film, is part of Advocacy Canada. He'll be on the panel. So he will be there at the screening and kind of bring voice to to personalize the film as well. So that's been really great. But for sure, requests for screening the film have come to the Nelson Museum, not to myself, but they've come to the Nelson Museum because they're the producers of this film.
And was there any, like, did you guys do a festival run or anything like that for the
Not
film?
really, not formally, no. There's a few reasons for that. But yeah, just wanted, again, to have our audience be more of the folks in this region at this point. And like that doesn't leave the festival run off the table. Like I said, I kind of feel like if this film was going to have a festival run, it might need to be reworked a little bit just to make it a little bit more relevant to an audience outside of here. But that's just my my perspective on the film. I think it's you don't want to lose those specific stories, but so much of what happens when you're watching this film, if you live here, is, oh, there's that place or that's that person. And
Sure.
so there's that kind of like feeling of like all this familiarity. And I think we would have to look at the film through the eyes of someone who didn't live here and maybe not, entirely restructure it, but like rework it so that there was a little bit less specificity there.
As someone who's not in BC or let alone Nelson, but here in Toronto and watching this film, I was like, wow, this is amazing, because who knew back in the 70s that they were like, gay guys coming together and creating a community and using, a couple's backyard and building, an area that they can access and use year after year after year to come and celebrate. And that's powerful, because sure, it's a local story, but it's a Canadian story. And I think that is what's so important about Queering the Interior. I know that Rainbow Country airs in St. John's, Newfoundland, and on CHMR, and the programmer there is working on a book about the queer history of Newfoundland and St. John's. And and she's trans, and I was saying to her when I did an interview with her a while back about, maybe have you thought about doing a documentary about the history that you're discovering? And she's like, that's an interesting idea. And I think that in 2022 and moving further on in time, maybe areas will start telling their personal stories. I know for Toronto, there was a documentary done in, I believe in 82 or something, 82, 83, called Track 2, Enough is Enough.
Right.
And I don't know if you've heard of this documentary, but it's about essentially the rise of Toronto's gay movement after the bathhouse raids.
Right.
And it's a powerful full-length documentary that was made back in the early 80s, and people can see it on YouTube for free.
Right.
If they wanted to. But I think that is what is so important, is telling our history and letting it be known and telling it, to, the specific region, but also sharing it with all of Canada. And I think that's what's most important, is to get our history out there. And I didn't know that about Nelson, BC. So well done to you and the people at the gallery.
Yeah, well, thank you. And it's nice to hear it impacted you. And I think there's plenty of elements of the film that are incredibly relatable to all aspects of our community.
Yeah.
And I think there has been definitely conversation about how to repurpose the film for a bigger audience. And I think, like talking to you and having these conversations about how the film's impacting people outside of our region. Because I think there is the thing about this particular piece that I think might be more unique, besides the fact that queer history is incredibly important, as we're saturated with non-queer history all the time. I feel like we have to queer the history, to use the term in the film. But like, I think that, it's a rural area, and like people had to take that much bigger of a step to come out to their neighbors than they would have lived in the gay, quote, neighborhood, village, ghetto, whatever it was called at any given era. So I think, if anything, there's a real story to be told around the rural space that queers have taken. And, Nelson is a shining example to me. I don't really know other queer communities in Canada that have the same robust, kind of vibrant, especially in the 80s and 90s and the 2000s. When I moved here, the community was very robust. And now it's almost as if when trans folks became more visible and started to claim their space, they have kind of been, integrated into our community in the same way that the lesbian, gay, and bisexual population was in the 80s and 90s and 2000s. So now we have this reputation here in this area in Nelson and the Kootenays of being very trans friendly. And so if you're a rural trans person, or you want to be a rural trans, you don't want to live in a city, this is one of those spaces is okay to come to. There's infrastructure for you both medically, socially, community-wise. And now the two-spirited community is starting to be seen and understood a little bit better. But we're just at the beginning of all that. We're just at the beginning of really understanding what that experience even is as settlers. So it's interesting. So I think there's a huge dialogue to still create, and the film for sure has a lot of potential that way. So you've been in, boosting the potential of this being a, to keep going. It's no piece of art is ever really done. It's you just walk away from it. But I don't think anyone's walked away from this yet. We're still looking for ways to get it out there for sure.
Amy Bohigian, thank you so much for your time. Well said, well done, and well made.
Thank you so much, Mark. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Appreciate the spotlight you shine on all of the folks out here doing the work in whatever way they are.
For more information on filmmaker Amy Bohigian, and to see the short documentary Queering the Interior, simply check out watershedproductions.ca.
Hi, I'm Eric Radford, Olympic and world champion figure skater, pianist, and composer, and you're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.
Taking us to hour 2 of Rainbow Country, the story behind Bryan Adams' #1 Studio 54 disco hit, Let Me Take You Dancing. So my last question for you, it's about a song that's near and dear to my personal heart. I believe it was a bit of a hit back in the 70s, 1979, maybe even a bit of a Canadian disco hit, the song Let Me Take You Dancing. And why does Bryan Adams hate this song so much?
Well, I mean, I can explain it, and I'm sure you'll understand. So that's one of the first songs Bryan and I wrote we wrote it in 78 or 79. So Bryan is, I think, 18. His voice was still in transition from sort of teenager to adult. He hadn't begun to sing in the gravelly voice he sings in now. He was still, not effeminate, but it was still a teenager's voice, and he also hadn't really decided who he was as an artist. I think anyone that knows him now would consider him a rock artist or pop artist, but back then he hadn't really decided. And disco was king. I mean, rock was really marginalized in the late 70s, and disco was everything. So we wrote this disco song, and
so you purposely did that.
We did, yeah. It was like we wrote a bunch of songs in and around that time, but this one was purpose. We wrote it with the disco style in mind, very, very much so, and it came to the attention of the record company. I think that song was very instrumental in Bryan getting signed to A&M Records. And they agreed to release a single. And it ended up being a hit in Canadian clubs. And then it came to the attention of a American disco producer who flew up, and we didn't re-record the song, but we added a lot of stuff to it. At his instruction, and then there was also some magical formula back then that we were unaware of, for a disco song, and this was religious. A disco song had to be 120 beats per minute, or it wouldn't get played in the USA in the clubs. So I think our version was, let's say, 118 beats per minute. So he had to speed it up 2 beats, and in doing so, Bryan's voice became even more kind of youngish, or even almost started to sound a little bit like a chipmunk. And that's what Bryan really objects to, is it's not really his voice. it kind of got sped up and digitized. But the good news is it was number one at Studio 54 in New York back in the heyday of disco. Yeah, so that was kind of the history of that song.
Phone rings. I got a message from the mayor. He's going to call me back the next day. I get the call, and he said, if you'd accept, we'd like to honor you with the key to the city. There was an event later that year in May. Just a key, right? Like, key to what? A decent job, a good singing career. It's really a metaphor, but it's history. So a reporter wants to talk to me and says, well, so it's a key, right? Like, what's the big deal? I said, well, not everybody gets the key. So I looked it up, and I guess it is kind of a big deal.
The date, May 17th, 2018, when trans activist Susan Gapka made history by becoming the first trans woman to be presented with the key to the city of Toronto. By the way, past recipients include Rush and the Raptors. And just like that, this little gay journey through Rainbow Country has come to an end. For the full 2-hour episode, simply head over to marktara.com where everything is connected and hit the archives banner. To keep up to date with the show, follow me on socials at Mark Tara. The podcast is available on all major platforms, including audible.com and iHeartRadio. And finally, I want to take this time to thank you for taking your time to be with me. Remember, despite all the craziness in the world these days, stay true to this, that we are living in days of making dreams come true. So, believe in yourself, and the world will believe in you.
Hi, this is Police Constable Danielle Botno, also known as LGBT Cop, and you're listening to Rainbow Country with Mark Tara.